We have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Earlier that morning, it looked like the Challenger might not launch at all. Yet, it launched. 73 seconds later, the greatest catastrophe of all time happened, witnessed by every American.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
The shuttle Challenger broke apart in the sky, ending the lives of all 7 astronauts on board. The darkest day in American space history. But what really happened in those final moments? What happened to the crew's bodies? Join us in this video as we walk back through the Challenger disaster and find out what happened to the bodies of the crew. What happened to the crew? As Challenger accelerated, 1 minute, 15 seconds into flight, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange 7 nautical miles, everything still sounded routine. But when the shuttle disintegrated high above the Atlantic, something crucial happened. The crew cabin separated from the rest of the vehicle, but remained largely intact. Engineers later discovered that the reinforced aluminum structure survived the initial explosion. It continued traveling upward on a ballistic arc for almost 3 minutes, rising to about 65,000 feet, before beginning its fatal descent toward the ocean. To people watching on the ground, the breakup looked instantly unsurvivable. But evidence later suggested that at least some of the crew survived the initial structural failure. Investigators found that several personal egress air packs, PAPs, had been manually activated. One of them belonged to pilot Michael J. Smith. Because the activation switch on Michael J. Smith's air pack was located on the back of his seat, he could not have turned it on himself. Someone else, another crew member, had to reach over and do it. That single detail strongly suggests that at least a few astronauts were still conscious after the shuttle broke apart. Investigators later found that several cockpit switches had also been moved by hand, not by the force of the explosion. This meant that Smith and possibly others were trying to restore power or regain control in the chaotic moments after the Challenger's destruction. NASA could never say with absolute certainty when the astronauts died. Some experts believe the crew lost consciousness within seconds due to rapid depressurization. Others argue that because the crew cabin did not rupture immediately, some or all of the astronauts may have remained conscious for part, or even most, of the nearly 3-minute fall. Those unanswered questions have become one of the most haunting aspects of the tragedy. The crew was trapped in a situation with no path to survival, falling helplessly toward the ocean. When the cabin finally hit the Atlantic, it was traveling at roughly 207 miles per hour. The force of impact, estimated at more than 200 times the pull of gravity, was far beyond anything a human or the shuttle's structure could survive. Even if the crew endured the breakup itself, the final impact was unsurvivable. According to astronauts and engineers who studied the tragedy closely, the crew were still alive. "Launch is fast," astronaut Story Musgrave explained. "It's bang, and then it's a 2-minute ride down. And you're conscious. We know that." Musgrave and others believe the crew survived inside the white cloud that millions saw on television. It wasn't the shuttle that exploded, it was the external fuel tank. Challenger itself didn't detonate. It broke apart, and the crew cabin, with all 7 astronauts alive inside, continued flying as an intact structure. So what happened to them later? Were they saved? Keep watching to find out. Recovering the bodies of the Challenger crew. In the aftermath of the disaster, NASA and the U.S. military launched one of the most extensive ocean recovery operations in American history. At first, teams focused on collecting the floating debris scattered across the surface. But within days, the mission expanded into a massive underwater search. Dozens of ships, aircraft, Navy submarines, and specialized dive crews were deployed, sweeping nearly 500 square nautical miles off the coast of Florida. It was a very important operation to Americans. On March 7, 1986, more than a month after the accident, divers from the USS Preserver made the discovery everyone feared: large sections of the Challenger crew compartment resting on the ocean floor. Inside that wreckage were the remains of the astronauts. The cabin lay between 100 and 200 feet deep, requiring both technical divers and remotely operated vehicles to gently lift pieces of the structure. NASA kept the recovery effort tightly controlled, emphasizing dignity, privacy, and respect as each set of remains was found. By April, most of the crew compartment had been raised, and the remains of all 7 astronauts had been recovered. One notable moment occurred when Gregory Jarvis's body, loosened by shifting debris, briefly floated away during recovery. Divers later found him on April 15th and brought him home with the others. Officials never released graphic descriptions to the public, but investigators privately acknowledged the harsh reality. The violent impact with the ocean, combined with a month underwater, left the remains severely fragmented and no longer recognizable as human bodies. The recovery of the Challenger crew became one of the most delicate and solemn missions NASA had ever undertaken. These astronauts were national heroes, and every step of the operation was carried out with an intense focus on dignity and respect. Once the remains were brought to the surface, they were transported under military escort to Patrick Air Force Base, where pathologists began the painful and complicated task of identification. As one expert explained, the crew might have briefly lost consciousness if the cabin depressurized, but the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to one truth: the impact against the ocean. After the remains were recovered, they were taken to the hospital at Patrick Air Force Base near Cape Canaveral. There, specialists from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology worked to identify each astronaut. The condition of the remains made the process extraordinarily difficult, and it took weeks to complete. Were they able to identify them, and what must have led to the crew's accident or demise? Keep watching to find out. Paying our last respects. Even with exhaustive analysis, medical examiners were unable to determine the exact cause of death for any individual crew member. The force of the ocean impact was so extreme that it obscured any evidence of whether decompression or lack of oxygen had caused death beforehand. NASA publicly confirmed that the remains had been recovered, but refused to release any details. Officials stated that, out of respect for the families, the condition of the remains and the specifics of the autopsy would not be disclosed. At the time, the New York Times reported that the remains could not be recognized as human, a stark and heartbreaking reminder of the violence of the accident. Families were notified privately, and NASA stood firm in its position that certain information was simply too painful and unnecessary to share with the public. There was also a legal dispute surrounding how the remains were handled, adding another layer of tension to an already devastating chapter in the aftermath of the disaster. Local medical examiners in Brevard County argued that they should have jurisdiction over the autopsies and the issuing of death certificates. NASA disagreed, insisting that the process be handled through the military to maintain security, consistency, and privacy for the families. In the end, NASA prevailed, and the agency issued the official death certificates, providing the necessary legal closure. In late April 1986, the remains of the Challenger crew were formally transferred aboard a military transport aircraft from Kennedy Space Center to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Each casket was draped with an American flag and escorted by military honor guards. Fellow astronauts accompanied the procession, creating one of the most dignified and solemn ceremonies NASA had ever conducted. It reflected not only national mourning, but the deep personal loss felt within the space community. Commander Francis R. Dick Scobie and pilot Michael J. Smith were laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, where their graves continue to serve as quiet places of remembrance for visitors. Ellison Onizuka was buried in Honolulu at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. Ronald McNair was laid to rest in his home state of South Carolina. Judith Resnick's remains were cremated, and her ashes were scattered at sea. Krista McAuliffe, the teacher whose presence aboard the mission captivated the nation, was buried in her hometown of Concord, New Hampshire. Gregory Jarvis was also cremated, with his ashes scattered in the Pacific Ocean. Because some remains were commingled during the recovery and could not be conclusively identified, NASA arranged a collective interment at Arlington National Cemetery. This group burial, located in Section 46, Grave 1129, became the final resting place for those unidentified portions of the Challenger crew. A memorial stands at the site, engraved with the poem High Flight, a piece long associated with aviators and astronauts. Its famous line, "I have slipped the surly bonds of Earth," resonates deeply in the context of the Challenger crew's final mission. The Arlington Memorial ensured that the Challenger crew would be remembered not only as individuals, but also as a team, a group of explorers who lost their lives together in the pursuit of discovery. Some people wonder why tragedies like this should be revisited at all. Why not leave the past buried, they ask. Doesn't it just reopen old wounds? But for many, it doesn't reopen anything. It reminds us of who we are. As one official put it, it's our history. It defines us as a nation, that we don't let adversity stop us. But what really happened to the Challenger? How did the world come about such tragedy? Keep watching to find out. The Challenger disaster. STS-51L was the 25th Space Shuttle mission and the 10th flight of Challenger. The crew, announced on January 27, 1985, was led by Commander Dick Scobie, with Michael Smith as pilot. Mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair rounded out the core team. Two payload specialists also joined the mission, Gregory Jarvis, who was scheduled to conduct research for Hughes Aircraft Company, and Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher selected for NASA's Teacher in Space project. The mission had several major objectives. The primary task was to deploy the TDR-SB tracking and data relay satellite using an inertial upper stage. The crew also planned to study Halley's Comet during its return near the Sun, and to deploy and later retrieve the Spartan Halley satellite. Originally set for July 1985, the mission encountered delay after delay, first pushed to November, then January 1986. The January 22nd launch date slipped multiple times until NASA rescheduled the liftoff for January 28th. January 28th, 1986, was forecast to bring some of the coldest temperatures ever seen for a shuttle launch. Overnight lows were expected to plunge to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, rising only to 22 degrees Fahrenheit around dawn and about 26 degrees Fahrenheit by the planned launch time of 9:38 a.m. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the manufacturer of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, were deeply concerned. Previous launches in warmer weather had already shown signs of O-ring erosion, and the extreme cold raised fears that the O-rings would not properly seal the SRB joints, an issue that could be catastrophic. Because of these concerns, Cecil Houston, who headed the Kennedy Space Center office of the Marshall Space Flight Center, arranged a three-way evening conference call on January 27th. Participants included officials at Morton Thiokol in Utah and teams at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The purpose was clear: discuss whether it was truly safe to launch under such unprecedented conditions. During the discussion, NASA's SRB project manager, Lawrence Malloy, pushed back hard. He rejected their analysis and challenged them directly, asking whether they expected him to delay the mission all the way until April just to wait for warmer weather. Despite this pressure, two senior Morton Thiokol leaders, Robert Lund, the Vice President of Engineering, and Joe Kilminster, the Vice President of Space Booster Programs, initially recommended against launching unless the temperature rose above 53 degrees Fahrenheit. As the teleconference paused for a private discussion among Morton Thiokol managers, Alan J. McDonald, the company's director of the Space Shuttle Solid Rocket Motor Project, speaking from Kennedy Space Center, urged his colleagues in Utah to highlight an important point: the delay in how the primary O-ring might seal compared to the secondary O-ring, which was supposed to serve as a backup. He hoped this would strengthen the engineering argument and stop Malloy from dismissing the concerns as inconclusive. But when the meeting resumed, everything had changed. Morton Thiokol's leadership reversed their stance. They now told NASA that the evidence of O-ring risk was inconclusive and that there was still substantial margin, even if the O-rings eroded or failed to seal immediately. This reversal, made under intense pressure, became one of the most heavily scrutinized decisions in the entire Challenger investigation. They ultimately decided to move forward with the launch. When McDonald told Malloy that as the on-site representative at Kennedy Space Center, he would not sign off on that decision, Malloy pushed back. He insisted that Morton Thiokol provide a written, signed recommendation approving the launch. Kilminster agreed to sign it and fax it from Utah right away. With that, the teleconference ended. Afterward, Malloy called Arnold Aldrich, the head of NASA's mission management team, to review the launch plans and the concerns about weather. He did not mention the O-ring warnings. Both men agreed the launch should continue. Why the sudden change of decision? Did the temperature get better? Keep watching to find out. The mistake that cost the world a crew. Overnight, the KSC ICE team recorded shockingly low temperatures. The left booster was at 25 degrees Fahrenheit, while the right booster had dropped to just 8 degrees Fahrenheit. These numbers were taken for engineering records only. They weren't reported up the chain because booster temperature wasn't listed in the official launch commit criteria. The extreme cold didn't just threaten the O-rings, it caused ice to form all over the fixed service structure. To keep the water lines from freezing, water was allowed to trickle through the system, since they couldn't fully drain it before launch. As the temperature plunged, the dripping water created sheets of ice as far as 240 feet down the structure. Engineers at Rockwell International, the company that built the orbiter, were alarmed. They feared that during liftoff, chunks of ice could break loose, slam into the shuttle's protective tiles, or even get sucked into an engine. Rocco Petrone, head of Rockwell's Space Transportation Division, and his team concluded that the amount of ice made the mission too dangerous. Aldrich, however, consulted with engineers at Kennedy and Johnson Space Center. They told him the ice did not pose a safety threat to the orbiter, and based on that assurance, he chose to move ahead with the launch. The launch was pushed back for another hour to give the ice more time to melt. When the ice team conducted a final inspection at T-20 minutes, they confirmed the ice was receding. With that, Challenger was cleared for liftoff at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, when the air temperature was just 36 degrees Fahrenheit. At T+0, right on schedule, Challenger lifted off from Launch Complex 39B at 11:38 a.m. Almost immediately, between T+0.678 seconds and T+3.375 seconds, cameras recorded 9 puffs of dark gray smoke coming from the right-hand solid rocket booster near the aft strut that connected it to the external tank. Investigators later concluded that these bursts of smoke were caused by the aft field joint shifting slightly at ignition. Because of the extreme cold, the O-rings inside the joint never formed a proper seal. Rainwater from the previous day had likely seeped into the joint as well, making the O-rings even less effective. With the seals compromised, hot gases pushed past the O-rings, burning and eroding them. Ironically, molten aluminum oxides from the burning booster fuel ended up creating a temporary plug, a fragile seal that briefly kept the flames from escaping through the joint. Meanwhile, the shuttle's main engines throttled down as planned to pass through maximum dynamic pressure. As Challenger climbed, it encountered pockets of wind shear starting at T+37 seconds. But the winds were still within the shuttle's design limits, and the guidance system compensated automatically. The shuttle's main engines automatically gimbaled to counteract the growing, asymmetric thrust caused by the right booster's burn-through. At T+72.284 seconds, the right solid rocket booster yanked itself free from the aft attachment strut on the external tank. That sudden separation created a sharp lateral jolt, one strong enough for the crew to feel inside the cockpit. At the same moment, pressure in the liquid hydrogen tank began to fall. What came next? How long until the disaster? Keep watching to find out. The destruction of the Challenger spacecraft. At T+73.124, white vapor started streaming from the external tank. Moments later, the aft dome of the LH-2 tank tore away completely. The liquid hydrogen inside instantly vented and ignited, blasting the tank forward into the liquid oxygen LOX tank with a force of roughly 3 million pounds. At the same time, the right SRB slammed into the interbank section. The collapse of both the LH-2 and LOX tanks triggered a BLEVE, a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion where supercold liquids flash into gas almost instantly. This chain of failures sent the shuttle stack veering violently off course. The changing attitude was hidden behind the huge vapor cloud from the disintegrating external tank. Traveling at Mach 1.92, Challenger suddenly faced aerodynamic forces far beyond its design limits. The orbiter broke apart into multiple major sections: a wing, the still-firing main engines, the crew cabin, and clouds of hypergolic fuel leaking from the ruptured reaction control system. The vehicle came apart at 46,000 feet. Inside Mission Control, NASA Public Affairs Officer Steve Nesbitt continued reading routine flight updates. He did not yet realize what had happened. Only when video of the exploding shuttle appeared on screen did the reality begin to register. At T+89, the ground control officer finally reported negative contact, loss of downlink, confirming that all communication from Challenger had ceased. Nesbitt's voice grew more measured as the situation unfolded. Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink. Moments later, he added, "We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. The flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point." In the back room, the weight of the disaster hit fast. Flight Director Jay Green immediately ordered contingency procedures. Mission Control went into lockdown. The doors were sealed, phone lines shut off, and computer terminals frozen. so all data could be preserved for the investigation. On July 28, 1986, NASA's Associate Administrator for Spaceflight, former astronaut Richard H. Truly, released a report written by physician and Skylab 2 astronaut Dr. Joseph P. Kerwin on the crew's final moments. Kerwin's conclusion was stark. There was no definitive way to determine exactly how the astronauts died. Because the cabin struck the ocean with such catastrophic force, any physical evidence from the seconds after the shuttle broke apart was essentially erased. Investigators found that the mid-deck floor had not buckled or torn in the way it would have during a rapid decompression. But there were other clues. Equipment showed damage consistent with decompression, and debris embedded between 2 forward windows hinted at a possible pressure loss. Because the impact destroyed so much of the structure, analysts could not determine whether this damage occurred before or during the final crash. In the end, the report left one painful truth. The crew's final seconds will never be fully known. How did America respond to this disaster? How did the world respond? Keep watching to find out. America's response to the Challenger disaster. President Ronald Reagan was supposed to deliver the 1986 State of the Union address on the evening of January 28, 1986, the same day Challenger was lost. After talking with his aides, he made the decision to postpone the speech. Instead, Reagan went on national television from the Oval Office to address the country and speak directly about the tragedy. A few days later, on January 31st, President Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan traveled to the Johnson Space Center for a memorial service honoring the 7 astronauts. During the ceremony, an Air Force band performed God Bless America, and a formation of NASA T-38 jets flew overhead, breaking into the traditional missing man formation in tribute. Not long after the disaster, questions emerged in Washington. Some politicians worried that White House officials, particularly Chief of Staff Donald Regan and Communications Director Pat Buchanan, might have pressured NASA to launch Challenger on January 28th so the president could reference the flight in his State of the Union speech. In March 1986, the White House released the original draft of Reagan's State of the Union remarks. The speech showed that Reagan had planned to mention an X-ray experiment aboard Challenger, designed by a guest invited to the address. But the draft indicated no further comments about the launch itself. When Reagan finally delivered the rescheduled State of the Union on February 4th, he paid tribute to the fallen Challenger crew and altered his earlier remarks about the X-ray experiment, saying it had been launched and lost. 2 months later, in April 1986, the White House released a report concluding that no pressure had been placed on NASA to launch Challenger before the State of the Union. In response to the Challenger Commission's recommendations, NASA undertook a complete redesign of the solid rocket boosters, creating what became known as the redesigned solid rocket motor. The redesign was supervised by an independent oversight group to ensure maximum safety. The new booster joint featured a capture mechanism on the tang inside the clevis to prevent joint rotation. The space between the capture feature and the clevis was sealed with an additional O-ring, reducing the potential for joint rotation to just 15% of what had occurred during the Challenger disaster. If rotation did occur, any reduction in the O-ring seal on one side would automatically increase the seal on the other side. Heaters were also added to maintain the O-rings at consistent, higher temperatures, further improving their reliability. The RSRM underwent its first test on August 30, 1987. Later, in April and August 1988, the boosters were deliberately tested with flawed joints that allowed hot gas to penetrate. These tests confirmed that the improved design successfully prevented dangerous joint rotation. After these successful evaluations, the RSRM was certified for flight on the space shuttle. Does the world still remember the heroes who gave their life in the Challenger disaster? How? Keep watching to find out. The efforts to never forget the Challenger disaster crew. It was necessary to keep the memories of the crew who passed away in the Challenger disaster. It was even more necessary to keep reminding the world of the huge disaster that could become of the smallest neglect of procedures like in the Challenger disaster. In the years following the Challenger disaster, a number of books explored what went wrong, why it happened, and how NASA responded. In 1987, journalist and eyewitness Malcolm McConnell published Challenger, A Major Malfunction, a true story of politics, greed, and the wrong stuff. McConnell's book sparked controversy for suggesting a conspiracy that NASA Administrator Fletcher awarded the contract to Morton Thiokol because it was based in his home state of Utah. That same year, Joseph Trento released Prescription for Disaster: From the Glory of Apollo to the Betrayal of the Shuttle, arguing that the space shuttle program itself had been flawed and heavily influenced by politics from the very start. In 1988, physicist Richard Feynman published his memoir, What Do You Care What Other People Think? Further Adventures of a Curious Character. The latter half of the book goes into the details of his work on the Rogers Commission and his collaboration with fellow Commissioner Roger Kutina. Books continued to appear long after the tragedy. In 1996, Diane Vaughan released The Challenger Launch Decision: Risky Technology, Culture, and Deviance at NASA, which argued that it wasn't just shuttle management at fault. Instead, NASA's very structure and mission culture encouraged risk-taking, creating the environment that made the disaster possible. Also in 1996, Klaus Jensen published No Downlink, a dramatic narrative about the Challenger accident and our time. His book focused on the history of rocketry leading up to Challenger, but drew criticism for relying mostly on secondary sources rather than original research. Finally, in 2009, Alan MacDonald, who had been a senior Morton Thiokol engineer at the time, co-wrote his memoir Truth, Lies, and O-Rings: Inside the Space Shuttle, Challenger Disaster, with space historian James Hansen. The book provides an insider account of the launch, the disaster, the investigation, and the return to flight. MacDonald is openly critical of NASA and Morton Thiokol leadership for going ahead with the launch, despite engineers' repeated warnings about the O-rings. Several films and television shows have explored the Challenger disaster over the years, each approaching the tragedy from different angles. On February 25, 1990, ABC aired a television movie titled Challenger, starring Barry Bostwick as Dick Scobie and Karen Allen as Krista McAuliffe. The film was critical of NASA and sympathetic toward the engineers who had warned against launching, though it was criticized by the widows of Mike Smith, Ronald McNair, and Ellison Onizuka for being an inaccurate portrayal of events. On March 18, 2013, the BBC broadcast a docudrama called The Challenger Disaster, starring William Hurt as physicist Richard Feynman. This production focused on the investigation into the causes of the disaster. A later film, also titled The Challenger Disaster, directed by Nathan von Minden and released on January 25, 2019, took a more fictionalized approach, depicting characters involved in the decision-making process to launch. The disaster has also appeared in television series. In the 11th episode of the sitcom Mixed-ish, titled When Doves Cry, the story explores the characters' grief, trauma, and eventual acceptance after witnessing the Challenger explosion. Netflix released a 4-part docuseries, Challenger: The Final Flight, on September 16, 2020. Created by Stephen Leckert and Glenn Zipper, the series features interviews with NASA and Morton Thiokol personnel, highlighting the flawed decision-making that led to the preventable disaster. The Australian drama The Newsreader, in its first episode broadcast on August 15, 2021, portrays the disaster from the perspective of television journalists at the time. It follows a newsroom navigating the emotional impact of reporting the event while exploring the broader shift in news presentation, from strictly factual to allowing personal emotion into broadcasts. Finally, the television drama This Is Us included the disaster in its Season 6 premiere titled The Challenger, using flashback scenes to depict the 1986 explosion and its impact on the characters' lives. What do you think about what happened to the bodies of the Challenger disaster crew? Do you think the tragedy would never have happened if they followed due processes? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you for staying till the end. We hope you learned a lesson or two about the Challenger spacecraft crew members. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Click the next video shown on your screen to catch up on more interesting stories like this. See you there.